Section 46 of The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. London, St. James Street. It is a curious circumstance that more buildings having a reputation for being haunted are discoverable in towns and cities than in sparsely populated places. The British metropolis, despite its gas lamps and guardian police, contains many residences that even now are left to the mercies of these spectral tenants who alone inhabit them. It must be confessed, however, that instead of increasing, the number of these disturbed residences, for reasons obvious to all, is rapidly decreasing. It is not many years since a house in St. James Street, the number of which it is as well to omit, acquired considerable notoriety on account of the unpleasant noises which took place in it. It had stood empty for a long time, in consequence of the annoyances to which the various tenants who had tried it had been subjected. There was one apartment in particular which nobody was able to occupy without being disturbed. On one occasion a youth, who, having been abroad for considerable time, had not any knowledge of the evil reputation this chamber had acquired, was put there to sleep on his arrival, as it was hoped his rest might not be disturbed. In the morning, however, he complained sadly of the terrible time he had had in the night, with people looking in at him between the curtains of his bed, and he avowed his determination to terminate his visit at once, as he could not possibly sleep there any more. After this period the house was again vacant for a considerable time, but was at length taken, and workmen were sent in to put it in habitable repair. One day, when the men were away at their dinner, says our informant, the master builder took the key with him and went to inspect progress, and having examined the lower rooms, he was ascending the stairs when he heard a man's foot behind him. He looked round, but there was nobody there, and he moved on again. Still there was somebody following, and he stopped and looked over the rails, but there was no one to be seen. So, though feeling rather queer, he advanced into the drawing-room, where a fire had been lighted, and wishing to combat the uncomfortable sensation that was creeping over him, he took hold of a chair, and drawing it resolutely along the floor, he slammed it down upon the hearth with some force, and seated himself in it, when, to his amazement, the action, and all its particulars of sound, was immediately repeated by his unseen companion, who seemed to seat himself beside him on a chair, as invisible as himself. Horror-stricken, the worthy builder started up and rushed out of the house. Section 47. London, the Tower. There is no place in the kingdom one would deem more likely to be haunted than that strange conglomeration of rooms, castles, and dungeons, known as the Tower of London. For many centuries it has been the scene of numberless deaths by violence, some by public execution, and others by private murder, until it is scarcely metaphorical language to declare that its walls have been built out of human bones and cemented by human blood. That ghosts and spectres have haunted its weird precincts no believer in the supernatural can doubt, and, if we may credit all that has been told of it of late years, its apparitions are not yet quite beings of the past. In Notes and Queries for 1860, the late Edmund Lenthal Swift, Keeper of the Crown Jewels, published a remarkable account of a spectral illusion witnessed by himself in the time-honored fortress, and his account, together with such additions and explanations as a subsequent correspondence invoked, shall now be presented to the reader. I have often purposed to leave behind me a faithful record of all that I personally know of this strange story, writes Mr. Swift, in response to an inquiry as to particulars of the ghost in the Tower of London. 43 years have passed, and its impression is as vividly before me as on the moment of its occurrence. But there are yet survivors who can testify that I have not at any time either amplified or abridged my ghostly experiences. In 1814 I was appointed keeper of the crown jewels in the Tower, where I resided with my family till my retirement in 1852. One Saturday night in October, 1817, about the witching hour, I was at supper with my wife, her sister, and our little boy in the sitting room of the Jewel House, which, then comparatively modernized, is said to have been the doleful prison of Anne Boleyn and of the 10 bishops whom Oliver Cromwell piously accommodated therein. The room was, as it still is, irregularly shaped, having 3 doors and 2 windows, which last are cut nearly 9 feet deep into the outer wall. Between these is a chimney-piece, projecting far into the room, and then surmounted with a large oil painting. On the night in question the doors were all closed, heavy and dark cloth curtains were let down over the windows, and the only light in the room was that of 2 candles on the table. I sat at the foot of the table, my son on my right hand, his mother fronting the chimney-piece, and her sister on the opposite side. I had offered a glass of wine and water to my wife, when, on putting it to her lips, she paused and exclaimed, "Good God, what is that?" I looked up and saw a cylindrical figure, like a glass tube, seemingly about the thickness of my arm, and hovering between the ceiling and the table. Its contents appeared to be a dense fluid, white and pale azure, like the gathering of a summer cloud, and incessantly mingling within the cylinder. This lasted about 2 minutes, when it began slowly to move before my sister-in-law, then, following the oblong shape of the table, before my son and myself. Passing behind my wife, it paused for a moment over her right shoulder. Observe, there was no mirror opposite to her in which she could there behold it. Instantly she crouched down, and with both hands covering her shoulder, she shrieked out, "Oh, Christ, it has seized me!" Even now, while writing, I feel the fresh horror of that moment. I caught up my chair, struck at the wainscot behind her, rushed upstairs to the other children's room, and told the terrified nurse what I had seen. Meanwhile, the other domestics had hurried into the parlor, where their mistress recounted to them the scene, even as I was detailing it above stairs. "The marvel," adds Mr. Swift, "of all this is enhanced by the fact that neither my sister-in-law nor my son beheld this appearance. When I the next morning related the night's terror to our chaplain, after the service in the Tower Church, he asked me, might not one person have his natural senses deceived? And if one, why might not 2? My answer was, if 2, why not 2,000? An argument which would reduce history, secular or sacred, to a fable. Our chaplain, remarked Mr. Swift, in a subsequent communication to Notes and Queries, suggested the possibilities of some foolery having been intromitted at my windows, and proposed the visit of a scientific friend, who minutely inspected the parlor, made the closest investigation, but could not in any way solve the mystery. In reply to further communications later on, the jewel keeper stated that his wife did not perceive any form in the cylindrical tube, but only the cloud or vapor which both of them at once described. Her health was not affected, nor was her life terminated, as had been suggested by the apparition which both had seen, nor could it have been, as Mr. Swift pertinently pointed out, a fog or vapor that seized his wife by the shoulder. Finally, replying to the suggestion of phantasmagoric agency, Mr. Swift not only made it clear that no optical action from outside could have produced any manifestation within, through the thick curtains, but also that the most skilful operator could not produce an appearance visible to only half the persons present, and that could bodily lay hold of one individual among them. The mystery remains unsolved. A more tragical incident following hard on the visitation to his own habitation is thus alluded to by Mr. Swift, and although the tale has been told by many, and in many different ways, as he was so closely connected with it, it is but just that the keeper's version should be the one accepted. One of the night sentries at the Jewel office, records our authority, was alarmed by a figure like a huge bear issuing from underneath the Jewel room door, as ghostly a door as ever was opened to or closed on a doomed man. He thrust at it with his bayonet, which stuck in the door, even as my chair tipped the wainscot. He dropped in a fit, and was carried senseless to the guard-room. When on the morrow I saw the unfortunate soldier in the main guard-room, continues Mr. Swift, his fellow sentinel was also there, and testified to having seen him on his post just before the alarm, awake and alert, and even spoken to him. Moreover, I then heard the poor man tell his own story. I saw him once again on the following day, but changed beyond my recognition. In another day or two, the brave and steady soldier, who would have mounted a breach, or led a forlorn hope with unshaken nerves, died at the presence of a shadow. Mr. George Ofor, referring to this tragedy, speaks of strange noises having also been heard when the figure resembling a bear was seen by the doomed soldier.
Section 48. Lowther Hall. According to Mr. J. Sullivan in his Cumberland and Westmoreland, the latter county never produced a more famous spectre, or bogey, to give the local term, than Jemmy Lowther, well known for want of a more appropriate name as the bad Lord Lonsdale. Infamous as a man, he was famous as a ghost. This notorious character, who is described as a modern impersonation of the worst and coarsest feudal baron ever imported into England by the Conqueror, became a still greater terror to the neighborhood after death than he had ever been during his life. So strongly had superstitious dread of the deceased nobleman impregnated the popular mind that it was asserted as an absolute fact that his body was buried with difficulty, and that whilst the clergyman was praying over it, it very nearly knocked him from his desk. When placed in his grave, Lord Lonsdale's power of creating alarm was not interred but with his bones. There were continual disturbances in the hall and noises in the stables, and, according to popular belief, neither men nor animals were suffered to rest. His lordship's phantom, coach, and six is still remembered and spoken of, and still believed in by some to be heard dashing across the country. Nothing is said of the bad lord's shape or appearance, and it is doubtful whether the spectre has ever appeared to sight, but it has frequently made itself audible. The hall became almost uninhabitable on account of the dead man's pranks, and out of doors was, for a long time, almost equally dreaded, as even there was constant danger of encountering the miscreant ghost. Of late years, this eccentric spirit appears to have relinquished its mortal haunts, and by the peasantry is believed to have been laid for ever under a large rock called Wallow Crag. Section 49. Lumley. Many judicial decisions have been based upon, or influenced by, the presumed testimony of apparitions. These pages contain more than one historical record of such cases, but none more singular than that of Anne Walker, which may be found fully detailed in the works of the famous Dr. Henry More, the Platonist. In 1680, according to Dr. More, there lived at Lumley, a village near Chester-le-Street, in the county of Durham, a widower named Walker, who was a man in good circumstances. Ann Walker, a young relation of his, kept his house, to the great scandal of the neighborhood, and, as it proved, with but too good cause. A few weeks before this young woman expected to become a mother, Walker placed her with her aunt, one Dame Cave, in Chester le Street, and promised to provide both for her and her future child. One evening, towards the end of November, this man, in company with Mark Sharp, an acquaintance of his, came to Dame Cave's door, and told her they had made arrangements for removing her niece to a place where she could remain in safety till her confinement was over. They would not say where it was, but as Walker bore in most respects an excellent character, he was allowed to take the young woman away with him, and he professed to have sent her away with his acquaintance Sharp into Lancashire. 14 days later, runs the story, one Graham, a fuller who lived about 6 miles from Lumley, had been engaged till past midnight in his mill, and on coming downstairs to go home, in the middle of the ground floor, he saw a woman, with dishevelled hair, covered with blood, and having 5 large wounds on her head. Graham, on recovering a little from his first terror, demanded what the spectre wanted. "I," said the apparition, "am the spirit of Ann Walker," and then proceeded to tell Graham the particulars which have already been related as to her removal from her aunt's abode. "When I was sent away with Mark Sharp," it proceeded, "he slew me on such a moor," naming one that Graham knew, "with collier's pick, threw my body into a coal pit, and hid the pick under the bank, and his shoes and stockings, which were covered with blood, he left in a stream." The apparition proceeded to tell Graham that he must give information of this to the nearest justice of the peace, and that till this was done he must look to be continually haunted. Graham went home very sad. He dared not bring such a charge against a man of so impeachable a character as Walker, and yet he as little dared to incur the anger of the spirit that had appeared to him. So, as all weak minds do, he went on procrastinating, only he took care to leave his mill early, and while in it never to be alone. Notwithstanding this caution on his part, one night, just as it began to be dark, the apparition met him again, in a more terrible shape, and with every circumstance of indignation. Yet he did not even then fulfil its injunction, till, on St. Thomas's Eve, as he was walking in his garden, just after the sunset, it threatened him so effectually that in the morning he went to the magistrate and revealed the whole thing. The place was examined, the body and the pickaxe found, and a warrant was granted against Walker and Sharp. They were, however, admitted to bail, but in August 1681 their trial came on before Judge Davenport at Durham. Meanwhile the whole circumstances were known all over the north of England, and the greatest interest was excited by the case. Against Sharp the fact was strong that his shoes and stockings, covered with blood, were found in the place where the murder had been committed, but against Walker, except the accounts received from the ghost, there seemed not a shadow of evidence. Nevertheless, the judge summed up strongly against the prisoners. The jury found them guilty, and the judge pronounced sentence upon them that night, a thing which was unknown in Durham either before or after. The prisoners were executed, and both died professing their innocence to the last. Judge Davenport was much agitated during the trial, and it was believed, says the historian, that the spirit had also appeared to him, as if to supply in his mind the want of legal evidence.
Section 50. Mannington Hall. Whether Lord Orford's Norfolk residence has the general reputation of being haunted, or whether the occasion of the much talked of spectral illusion to Dr. Augustus Jessup is the only known instance of an apparition having appeared there, we are not in a position to state. The remarkable story as communicated by Dr. Jessup, the well-known antiquary, to the Athenaeum of January 1880 is as follows. On the 10th of October 1879, Dr. Jessup drove to Lord Orford's from Norwich. It was his intention to spend some time at the Hall in examining and making extracts from various scarce works which he had long been seeking for, and which he now learnt were in Lord Orford's library. He arrived at Mannington at 4 in the afternoon, and after some agreeable conversation dressed for dinner. Dinner took place at 7, and was partaken of by 6 persons, including Dr. Jessup and his host. The conversation is declared to have been of a pleasant character, to have been chiefly concerned with artistic questions and the experiences of men of the world, and to have never trenched upon supernatural subjects. After dinner cards were introduced, and at 10:30, 2 of the guests having to leave, the party broke up. Dr. Jessup now desired to be permitted to sit up for some hours in order to make extracts from the works already referred to. Lord Orford wished to leave a valet with his guest, but the doctor, deeming that this might embarrass him and cause him to go to bed earlier than he wished, requested to be left to his own devices. This was agreed to, the servants were dismissed, and the host and his other guests retired to their rooms, so that by 11 o'clock Dr. Jessup was the only person downstairs. The apartment in which he was preparing to set to work for a few hours is a large one, with a huge fireplace and a great old-fashioned chimney, and is furnished with every luxury. The library, whence Dr. Jessup had to bring such volumes as he needed, opens into this room, and in order to obtain the works he wanted to, he not only had to go into it, but when there to mount a chair to get down the books he required. In his very circumstantial account of the affair, the antiquary relates that he had altogether 6 small volumes, which he took down from their shelves and placed in a little pile on the table at his right hand. In a little while he was busily at work, sometimes reading, sometimes writing, and thoroughly absorbed in his occupation. As he finished with a book, he placed it in front of him, and then proceeded with the next, and so on until he had only 1 volume of his little pile of tomes left to deal with. The antiquary, being, as he states, of a chilly temperament, sat himself at a corner of the table with the fire at his left. Occasionally he rose, knocked the fire together, and stood up to warm his feet. In this manner he went on until nearly 1 o'clock, when he appears to have congratulated himself upon the rapid progress he had made with his task, and that after all he should get to bed by 2. He got up and wound up his watch, opened a bottle of seltzer water, and then reseating himself at the table, upon which were 4 silver candlesticks containing lighted candles, he set to work upon the last little book of the heap. What now happened must be told in Dr. Jessup's own words. I had been engaged upon it about half an hour, said he, referring to the little volume, and was just beginning to think that my work was drawing to a close, when, as I was actually writing, I saw a large white hand within a foot of my elbow. Turning my head, there sat a figure of a somewhat large man, with his back to the fire, bending slightly over the table, and apparently examining the pile of books that I had been at work upon. The man's face was turned away from me, but I saw his closely cut reddish-brown hair, his ear and shaved cheek, the eyebrow, the corner of the right eye, the side of the forehead, and the large high cheek-bone. He was dressed in what I can only describe as a kind of ecclesiastical habit of thick corded silk, or some such material, close up to the throat, and a narrow rim or edging of about an inch broad of satin or velvet, serving as a stand-up collar, and fitting close to the chin. The right hand which had first attracted my attention was clasping, without any great pressure, the left hand. Both hands were in perfect repose, and the large blue veins of the right hand were conspicuous. I remember thinking that the hand was like the hand of Velasquez's magnificent Dead Knight in the National Gallery. I looked at my visitor for some seconds, and was perfectly sure that he was not a reality. 1,000 thoughts came crowding upon me, but not the least feeling of alarm, or even uneasiness. Curiosity and a strong interest were uppermost. For an instant I felt eager to make a sketch of my friend, and I looked at a tray on my right for a pencil. Then I thought, upstairs I have a sketch-book, shall I fetch it? There he sat, and I was fascinated, afraid not of his staying, but lest he should go. Stopping in my writing, I lifted my left hand from the paper, stretched it out to the pile of books, and moved the top one. I cannot explain why I did this. My arm passed in front of the figure, and it vanished. I was simply disappointed, and nothing more. I went on with my writing as if nothing had happened, perhaps for another 5 minutes, and had actually got to the last few words of what I had determined to extract, when the figure appeared again, exactly in the same place and attitude as before. I saw the hands close to my own. I turned my head again to examine him more closely, and I was framing a sentence to address him when I discovered that I did not dare speak. I was afraid of the sound of my own voice. There he sat, and there sat I. I turned my head again to my work and finished writing the 2 or 3 words I still had to write. The paper and my notes are at this moment before me, and exhibit not the slightest tremor or nervousness. I could point out the words I was writing when the phantom came, and when he disappeared. Having finished my task, I shut the book and threw it on the table. It made a slight noise as it fell. The figure vanished. Throwing myself back in the chair, I sat for some seconds looking at the fire with a curious mixture of feeling, and I remember wondering whether my friend would come again, and if he did, whether he would hide the fire from me. Then first there stole upon me a dread and a suspicion that I was beginning to lose my nerve. I remember yawning. Then I rose, lit my bedroom candle, took my books into the inner library, mounted the chair as before, and replaced 5 of the volumes. The 6th I brought back and laid upon the table where I had been writing, when the phantom did me the honour to appear to me. By this time I had lost all sense of uneasiness. I blew out the 4 candles, and marched off to bed, where I slept the sleep of the just, or the guilty, I know not which, but I slept very soundly. And that is the conclusion of the story, so far as Dr. Jessop's published account goes. Numerous elucidations have been attempted by the wise and the otherwise, but whether hallucination, spectral illusion, or trickery, no one has been enabled to prove, and as the hero of the tale declines to proffer explanation, theory, or inference, the affair continues to be a mystery.
Section 51, Milford Haven. In July 1858, Mr. John Pavan Phillips, a well-known contributor to Notes and Queries, furnished that valuable publication with some instances of second sight and supernatural warnings, which had occurred either to himself or to his most immediate relatives. The whole country of Pembroke, Mr. Pavan Phillips states, is rife with tales of this class, and indeed, he might have added, every country of the 3 kingdoms as well. So universal and deeply defined is the belief in them. From the stories, for the authenticity of which this gentleman vouches, may be cited the following. Many years ago, 7 or 8 members of the family of my paternal grandfather were seated at the door of his house on a fine summer evening, between the hours of 8 and 9 o'clock. The parish church and its yard are only separated from the spot by a brook and a couple of meadows. The family happened to be looking in the direction of the churchyard, when they were amazed by witnessing the advent of a funeral procession. They saw the crowd and the coffin borne on men's shoulders come down the pathway towards the church, but the distance was too great to enable them to recognize the faces of any of the actors in the scene. As the funeral cortege neared the church porch, they distinctly saw the clergyman, with whom they were personally acquainted, come out in his surplice to meet the mourners, and saw him precede them into the church. In a short time they came out, and my relative saw them go to a particular part of the yard, where they remained for a time long enough to allow the remainder of the supposed funeral rites to be performed. Greatly amazed at what he beheld, my grandfather sent over to the church to inquire who had been buried at that unusual hour. The messenger returned with the intelligence that no person had been buried during that day, nor for several days before. A short time after this a neighbour died, and was buried in the precise spot where the phantom interment was seen. The whole of Mr. Pavan Phillips's family would appear to have possessed the faculty of ghost-seeing, or rather to have been endowed with the capability, so well known amongst the Scotch, of second sight. In another instance of this power of foreseeing events, his mother was the medium. Her father, says our authority, lived on the banks of one of the many creeks or pills with which the beautiful harbour of Milford Haven is indented. In front of the house is a large court, built on a quay wall, to protect it from the rising tide. In this court my mother was walking one fine evening, rather more than 60 years ago. This was written in 1858, enjoying the moonlight and the balmy summer breeze. The tide was out, so that the creek was empty. Suddenly my mother's attention was aroused by hearing the sound of a boat coming up the Pill. The measured dip of the oars in the water and the noise of their revolution in the rowlocks were distinctly audible. Presently she heard the keel of the boat grate on the gravelly beach by the side of the quay wall. Greatly alarmed, as nothing was visible, she ran into the house, and related what she had heard. A few days afterwards, the mate of an East Indiaman, which had put into Milford Haven for the purpose of undergoing repair, died on board, and his coffined corpse was brought up the Pill, and landed at the very spot where my mother heard the phantom boat touch the ground. In the next incident of supernatural foresight related by Mr. Pavin Phillips, it is in a servant of the family that the power is manifested, so that it would appear as if the locality, rather than the dwellers in it, were haunted. He relates that in the year 1838 he was on a visit to his parents, who, at that time, resided on the spot on which my mother was born, and where she passed the later years of her life. Within a short distance of the house stood a large walled garden, which was approached through a gate leading into a stable yard. From underneath the garden wall bubbled a well of delicious spring water, whence the domestic offices were supplied. It was a custom of the family, in the summer time, that the water for the use of the house should be brought in late in the evening, in order that it might be cool, and it was the duty of a servant to go out with a yoke and a couple of pails to fetch the water just before the time of closing up the house for the night. One evening the girl had gone out for this purpose. The night was beautifully fine, the moon shining so brightly that the smallest object was distinctly visible. The servant had not been absent many minutes when she ran into the house without her burden, and throwing herself into a chair in a state of extreme terror, fainted away. Restoratives having been used, she recovered a little, and upon being questioned as to the cause of her alarm, she told us that as she was stooping over the well, about to fill one of her pails, she suddenly found herself in the midst of a crowd of people who were carrying a coffin, which they had set down at the gate of the stable yard. As she had received no intimation of the approach of the concourse by any sound of footsteps, she was greatly alarmed, and as the object borne by the throng did not tend to tranquilize her nerves, she took to her heels, leaving her pails behind her. As no persuasion could induce her to return to the well, I offered to do so for her, and to ascertain the cause of her terror. When I arrived at the stable yard, there was neither coffin nor crowd to be seen, and upon asking a neighbour, whose cottage commanded a view of the well, whether she had seen a funeral go by, she put a stop to any further inquiry by asking me who had ever heard of a funeral at 10 o'clock at night, to which put inquiry I could only reply by stating what the servant professed to have seen. So the matter rested for a few weeks, when there occurred an unusually high tide in Milford Haven. The water rose above the level of the ordinary springs, filling the creek and flowing into the court in front of the house. It only ebbed when it had reached the door. The roadway at the end of the Pill was impassable. A person having died on the opposite side of the inlet a few days before this, the funeral took place on the morning of the high tide, and as it was impossible to take the corpse to the parish church by the usual route, the bearers crossed the Pill in a boat with the coffin, and having laid it down at the gate of our stable yard, remained there until the boat could bring over the remainder of the funeral concourse. The last instance of this insight into the future which we shall cite from Mr. Pavin Phillips's highly suggestive and interesting communication is the record of an incident of the character referred to which occurred to him himself in the year 1848, upon his return home after several years' absence. A few days after my arrival, he states, I took a walk one morning in the yard of one of our parish churches, through which there is a right of way for pedestrians. My object was twofold. One, firstly, to enjoy the magnificent prospect visible from that elevated position, and secondly, to see whether any of my friends or acquaintances who had died during my absence were buried in the locality. After gazing around me for a short time, I sauntered on, looking at one tombstone and then at another, when my attention was arrested by an altar tomb enclosed within an iron railing. I walked up to it, and read an inscription, which informed me that it was in memory of Colonel. This gentleman had been the Assistant Poor Law Commissioner for South Wales, and while on one of his periodical tours of inspection, he was seized with apoplexy in the workhouse of my native town, and died in a few hours. This was suggested to my mind as I read the inscription on the tomb, as the melancholy event occurred during the period of my absence, and I was only made cognizant of the fact through the medium of the local press. Not being acquainted with the late colonel, and never having seen him, the circumstances of his sudden demise had long passed from my memory, and were only revived by my thus viewing his tomb. I then passed on, and shortly afterwards returned home. On my arrival, my father asked me in what direction I had been walking. I replied in churchyard, looking at the tombs, and among others I have seen the tomb of Colonel, who died in the workhouse. That, replied my father, is impossible, as there is no tomb erected over Colonel's grave. At this remark I laughed. My dear father, said I, you want to persuade me that I cannot read? I was not aware the Colonel was buried in the churchyard, and was only informed of the fact by reading the inscription on the tomb. Whatever you may say to the contrary, said my father, what I tell you is true. There is no tomb over Colonel's grave. Astounded by the reiteration of this statement, as soon as I had dined, I returned to the churchyard, and again inspected all the tombs having railings round them, and found that my father was right. There was not only no tomb bearing the name of Colonel, but there was no tomb at all corresponding in appearance with the one I had seen. Unwilling to credit the evidence of my own senses, I went to the cottage of an old acquaintance of my boyhood, who lived outside the churchyard gate, and asked her to show me the place where Colonel lay buried. She took me to the spot, which was a green mound, undistinguished in appearance from the surrounding graves. Nearly 2 years subsequent to this occurrence, surviving relatives erected an altar tomb, with a railing round it, over the last resting place of Colonel, and it was, as nearly as I could remember, an exact reproduction of the memorial of my daydream.
Section 52. Nanai. Nanai, the ancient residence of the Vaughan family, in Merionethshire, is said to stand upon the highest ground of any gentleman's seat in Great Britain. In the days of the famous Owain Glendower, this romantically situated dwelling was occupied by Hywel Seyle, a first cousin of the Welsh prince. The cousins do not appear to have lived on friendly terms, Hywel Seyle siding with the Lancastrians, whilst Glendower, it need scarcely be remarked, was a fierce Yorkist. Ultimately their antagonism came to a fatal termination. There are several versions of the legend, but it is better to adopt that related by Pennant, because, although it does not accord with some of the ballads on the subject, it appears to have a historic basis. The historian states that Glendower and Seyle, having long been at variance, the abbot of Keimer brought them together in hopes of reconciling them, and had apparently succeeded in effecting this charitable purpose. Whilst the two cousins were out hunting together after their apparent reconciliation, Owain observed a doe feeding, and remarked to Hywel, who was considered the best archer of the day, that there was a fine mark for him. Hywel bent his bow, and pretending to take aim at the doe, suddenly turned and discharged his arrow full at Glendower's breast. Then cursed Hywel's cruel shaft, his royal brother's blood had quaffed, alas, for Cambria's weal, but the false arrow glanced aside, for 'neath the robe of royal pride lay plate of Milan steel. Footnote: The Demon Oak, by Walter Thornbury. End of footnote. Fortunately for him, the Welsh chieftain, as described by the poet, had armour beneath his clothes, and therefore received no hurt. But, enraged at his kinsman's treachery, he turned upon him fiercely, and although Hywel was fully armed, after a short conflict, slew him. The next thing was how to dispose of the body, and according to the ballad of the Spirit's Blasted Tree, by the Reverend George Warrington, it was Madog, Glendower's companion, who suggested for the place of sepulture a bread and blasted oak, scorched by the lightning's vivid glare, hollow its stem from branch to root, and all its shrivelled arms were bare. Be this, I cried, the proper grave. The thought in me was deadly sin. Aloft we raised the hapless chief, and dropped his bleeding corpse within. After this dire catastrophe, Glendower returned in haste to his stronghold, without, of course, giving any information to the Lord of Nanai's people. Hywel was sought for in every direction, but was nowhere to be found. His alarmed retainers hunted through all the recesses of the neighbouring forest, the while his sorrowing wife shut herself up from all comfort in the solitude of her gloomy castle. The years passed by, and no tidings reached Nanai of the missing lord. Yet fancy, in 1,000 shapes, bore to his home the chief once more. Some saw him on high Mold's top, some saw him on the winding shore. With wonder fraught the tale went round, amazement changed the hearer's tongue. Each peasant felt his own sad loss, yet fondly o'er the story hung. Oft by the moon's pale shadowy light, his aged nurse and steward grey would lean to catch the storied sounds, or mark the flitting spirit stray. Pale lights on Cada's rocks were seen, and midnight voices heard to moan. 'Twas even said the blasted oak, convulsive, heaved a hollow groan. But still the fate of Hywel Seyle remained unknown to everyone save Glendower and his companion Madog. At last, after 10 years of silence, Glendower died, and the partaker of the chieftain's secret was at liberty to reveal the mystery, his lord's last words being, "To sailor's sad widow bear the tale, nor let our horrid secret rest. Give but his course to sacred earth, then may my parting soul be blessed." Madog hastened to obey his prince's last behest, and as soon as events allowed, betook himself to Nanai's saddened home, and told the horrified and long-hoping wife that she was a widow indeed. The revelation was rapidly noised abroad among the retainers, and confirmation of it demanded. Madog led them to the blasted oak, which was hastily rent open, and the bleaching skeleton exposed to view. Back they recoiled, the right hand still, contracted grasped the rusty sword, which erst in many a battle gleamed, and proudly decked their slaughtered lord. They bore the corse to Vanna's shrine, with holy rites and prayers addressed. 9 white-robed monks the last dirge sang, and gave the angry spirit rest. But notwithstanding the burial rites were read, and many masses said for their dead lord, his spirit was not believed to be at rest, and almost down to the present day the fearsome peasant has dreaded to pass at night by the blasted oak, "the hollow oak of the demons," until its fall and destruction on the 13th of July 1813. The haunted tree was an object of nocturnal dread, and the poet could truly say, "And to this day the peasant still with fear avoids the ground, in each wild branch a spectre sees, and trembles at each rising sound."
Section 57. Oxford University Queen's College. Like most of the older foundations of Alma Mater, Queen's College has had its ghost. The Reverend Mr. Moore of Leighton, Essex, formerly of Queen's Oxford, a man of veracity and learning, who died in 1778, left this story of an apparition that favoured his own college with a visit. Mr. John Bonnell was a commoner of Queen's College, Oxford. He was remarkable in his person and gait, and, from a peculiar manner he had of holding up his gown behind, might be recognised almost as readily by his back as by his face. On Sunday, November the 18th, 1750, at noon, Mr. Ballard, who was then of Magdalen College, and myself, says Mr. Moore, were talking together at Parker's door. I was then waiting for the sound of the trumpet for dinner, and suddenly Mr. Ballard cried out, "Dear me, who is that coming out of your college?" I looked and saw, as I supposed, Mr. Bonnell, and replied, "He is a gentleman of our house, and his name is Bonnell. He comes from Stanton Harcourt." "Why, bless me," said Mr. Ballard, "I never saw such a face in all my life." I answered slightly, "His face is much the same as it always is. I think it is a little more inflamed and swelled than it is sometimes. Perhaps he has buckled his band too tight. But I should not have observed it if you had not spoken." "Well," said Mr. Ballard again, "I shall never forget him as long as I live," and appeared to be much disconcerted and frightened. "This figure I saw without any emotion or suspicion," proceeds Mr. Moore. "It came down the quadrangle, came out of the gate, and walked up the High Street. We followed it with our eyes till it came to Catherine Street, where it was lost. The trumpet then sounded, and Mr. Ballard and I parted, and I went into the hall and thought no more of Mr. Bonnell. In the evening the prayers of the chapel were desired for one who was in a very sick and dangerous condition. When I came out of the chapel, I inquired of one of the scholars, James Harrison, in the hearing of several others who were standing before the kitchen fire, who it was that was prayed for, and he answered, "Mr. Bonnell senior." "Bonnell senior," said I, with astonishment. "What is the matter with him? He was very well to-day, for I saw him go out to dinner." "You are very much mistaken," answered Harrison, "for he has not been out of his bed for some days." I then asserted more positively that I had seen him, and that a gentleman was with me who saw him too. This came presently to the ears of Dr. Fothergill, who had been my tutor. After supper he took me aside and questioned me about it, and said he was very sorry I had mentioned the matter so publicly, for Mr. Bonnell was dangerously ill. I replied that I was very sorry too, but I had done it innocently. The next day Mr. Bonnell died. Mr. Moore states that Mr. Ballard was applied to and bore witness to the fact that the figure he had so particularly noticed was stated to be Mr. Bonnell, who was of Queen's and came from Stanton Harcourt. It may, also, be added that when this curious story, found among the Reverend Mr. Moore's papers after his decease, was published in the Gentleman's Magazine and other contemporary publications, the particulars were confirmed in various ways by persons referred to in the story. As the account of an apparition or wraith of a person at the point of death, seen by more than one individual, it is by no means unique in literary records.
Section 59. Plymouth. Amongst the innumerable multitude of buildings which have the reputation of being haunted, it will be noted that by far the larger number are haunted by strange noises and mysterious sounds only, but few of them really attaining to the dignity of being visited by visible beings. Some of the places, however, which have had the character of being disturbed by unusual and unaccountable noises, are very interesting from the suggestiveness of these noises. In the following account, for instance, and indeed in many others, the ghostly but invisible visitants appear to be condemned to return to the occupations they followed before they shuffled off the mortal coil, and to resume, after their incorporeal fashion, the labours of their past life. The mother of the famous premier, George Canning, after the death of her first husband, became an actress and married an actor. Becoming a widow for the second time, she married a third husband named Hun, and under his name appears to have acted in the provinces. Among other provincial towns, Miss Hun visited Plymouth, but previous to her arrival there she had requested Mr. Bernard, who was in some way connected with the theatre there, to procure lodgings for her in the town. When Miss Hun arrived, she was met by Mr. Bernard, with the intimation that if she were not afraid of a ghost, he could obtain very comfortable lodgings for her at a very low rate. For there is, said he, a house belonging to our carpenter that is reported to be haunted, and nobody will live in it. If you like to have it, you may, and for nothing, I believe, for he is so anxious to get a tenant. Only you must not let it be known that you do not pay any rent for it. Miss Hun, alluding to theatrical apparitions, said it would not be the first time she had had to do with a ghost, and that she was very willing to encounter this one. So she had her luggage taken into the house in question, and the bed prepared. At her usual hour she sent her maid and her children to bed, and curious to see if there was any foundation for the rumours she had heard, she seated herself with a couple of candles and a book to watch the event. Beneath the room she occupied was the carpenter's workshop, which had 2 doors. The one which opened into the street was barred and bolted within. The other, a smaller one, opening into the passage, was only on the latch, and the house was, of course, closed for the night. She had read somewhat more than half an hour, when she perceived a noise issuing from this lower apartment, which sounded very much like the sawing of wood. Presently, other such noises as usually proceeded from a carpenter's workshop were added, till, by and by, there was a regular concert of knocking and hammering and sawing and planing, etc., the whole sounding like half a dozen busy men in full employment. Being a woman of considerable courage, Miss Hun resolved, if possible, to penetrate the mystery. So, taking off her shoes, that her approach might not be heard, with her candle in her hand, she very softly opened her door and descended the stairs, the noise continuing as loud as ever, and evidently proceeding from the workshop, till she opened the door, when instantly all was silent, all was still, not a mouse was stirring, and the tools and the wood and everything else lay as they had been left by the workmen when they went away. Having examined every part of the place, and satisfied herself that there was nobody there, and that nobody could get into it, Miss Hun ascended to her room again, beginning almost to doubt her own senses, and question with herself whether she had really heard the noise or not, when it recommenced, and continued without intermission for about half an hour. She, however, went to bed, and the next day told nobody what had occurred, having determined to watch another night before mentioning the affair to anyone. As, however, this strange scene was acted over again, without her being able to discover the cause of it, she now mentioned the circumstance to the owner of the house and to her friend, Mr. Bernard, and the former, who would not believe it, agreed to watch with her, which he did. The noise began as before, and he was so horror-struck that instead of entering the workshop, as she wished him to do, he rushed into the street. Miss Hunt continued to inhabit the house the whole summer, and when referring afterwards to the adventure, she observed that use was second nature, and that she was sure if any night these ghostly carpenters had not pursued their visionary labours, she should have been quite frightened lest they should pay her a visit upstairs.
Section 60. Powis Castle. According to Camden, this ancient stronghold was formerly called Castell Coch, or Red Castle, on account of the colour of the stone with which it was built. It stands on a rocky elevation in the midst of a well-wooded park, and despite the restoration which it has undergone at the hands of Sir Robert Smirke, is not considered a thing of beauty. If the outside be irregular in style, the interior is heavy and gloomy, and thoroughly appropriate for the localization of ghostly legends. It possesses, among other interesting relics, a state chamber, still maintained in the exact condition it was in when prepared for the reception of Charles I. Since the time of Queen Elizabeth, when the surrounding estate was purchased by the Herberts, Powis Castle has been the seat of the Earls Powis. There are naturally various legends connected with this time-honoured dwelling, one being that the lake in the castle park, from which the adjacent town of Welshpool takes its name, shall sometime overflow and deluge the town. But there is also a well-authenticated and most circumstantial ghost story of Powis Castle, for the record of which we are indebted to the autobiography of Thomas Wright of Berkenshaw. In 1780 it became known to the townsfolk of Welshpool that there was living amongst them a certain poor unmarried woman who had conversed with the castle ghost, and that it had confided a great secret to her. The woman thus selected for this alleged trust was a member of the Methodist Society, and had become serious under their ministry. Mr. John Hampson, a well-known preacher amongst the Wesleyan Methodists, being desirous of probing this strange story to the core, sent for the woman, and earnestly besought her to tell him the whole truth about the affair. She promised to give him as exact an account as she possibly could, and then proceeded with the following narration, to the correctness of which many persons could bear witness. She described herself as a poor woman, who obtained a livelihood by spinning hemp and line, and stated that it was customary for the farmers and gentlemen of the district to grow enough hemp or line in their fields for their own home consumption, and as she was a good hand at spinning, she was accustomed to go from house to house to inquire for work. It was the custom at houses where she stayed to provide her with meat and drink, and, if necessary, with lodging, while she was thus employed, and when she left, to make her some little present. One day she chanced to call at Earl Powis's country residence, Red Castle, as it was called, to inquire for work, according to custom. The quality, as she termed the family, were at this time in London, but had, as usual, left the steward and his wife, with certain other servants, to take charge of the place during their absence. The steward's wife set her to work, and in the evening told her that she must stay all night with them, as they had more work for her to do next day. When it was time to go to bed, 3 of the servants, each carrying a lighted candle in her hand, conducted her to the room she was to sleep in. It was an apartment on the ground floor, with a boarded floor and 2 sash windows, and was grandly furnished, with a handsome bedstead in one corner of it. They had made up a good fire for her, and had placed a chair and table before it, with a large lighted candle upon the table. They informed her that was to be her bedroom, and that she might go to bed whenever she pleased. They then wished her a good night, and all withdrew together, pulling the door quickly after them, so as to hasp the spring sneck in the brass lock that was upon it. When the servants had thus hastily departed, the poor spinster gazed around at the grand furniture, and was in no slight astonishment that they should put such a person as she was in so fine a room and so comfortable a bed, with all the conveniences of fire, chair, table, and candle. After having made a survey of the place, she sat down, and took out of her pocket a small Welsh Bible, which she always carried about with her, and in which she always read a chapter, chiefly in the New Testament, before she said her prayers and retired to rest. Whilst the woman was reading, she heard the door open, and, turning her head, was astonished to see a gentleman enter the room. He wore a gold-laced hat and waistcoat, with coat and the rest of his attire to correspond. He walked down by the sash window to the corner of the room, and then returned. When he came, as he returned to the first window, the bottom of which was nearly breast high, he rested his elbow on the bottom of the window, and the side of his face upon the palm of his hand, and stood in that leaning posture for some time, with his side partly towards her. She looked at him earnestly to see if she knew him, but although, from her frequent intercourse with them, she had a personal knowledge of all the family and its retainers, he appeared to be a perfect stranger to her. She supposed afterwards that he stood in this manner to encourage her to speak, but as she did not utter a word, after some little time he walked off, pulling the door to after him as the servants had done previously. She began now to be much alarmed, concluding it to be an apparition, and that they had put her in that grand room because it was haunted, and that was really the case. For some long time past the room had been so disturbed that nobody could sleep in it peaceably, and as she passed for a very serious woman, the servants conceived the fine project of putting the poor Methodist and the spirit together, in order to see what the result would be. Startled at the thought that it was an apparition she had seen, the woman rose from her chair, and kneeling down by the bedside, began saying her prayers. While she was praying, the apparition came in again, walked round the room, and came close behind her. She now endeavoured to speak, but when she attempted it, she was so agitated that she could not utter a word. The apparition walked out of the room again, pulling the door after it as it had done before. She begged that God would strengthen her, and not suffer her to be tried beyond what she was able to bear. She now recovered her spirits somewhat, and thought she felt more confidence and resolution, and determined, if it came in again, she would speak to it if possible. Presently it came in again, walked around the room, and came behind her as before. She turned her head and said, "Pray, sir, who are you, and what do you want?" It lifted its finger and said, "Take up the candle and follow me, and I will tell you." She got up, took up the candle, and followed it out of the room. It led her through a long boarded passage till they got to the door of another room, which it opened and went into. It was a very small room, or what might be called a large closet. "As the room was small, and I believed him to be a spirit," said she in her recital of the affair, "I stopped at the door. He turned and said, 'Walk in, I will not hurt you.' So I walked in. Then he said, 'Observe what I do.' I said, 'I will.' He stopped and tore up one of the boards of the floor, and there appeared under it a box with an iron handle in the lid. He said, 'Do you see that box?' I said, 'Yes, I do.' He then stepped to one side of the room, and showed me a crevice in the wall where he said a key was hid that would open it. He said, 'This box and key must be taken out and sent to the Earl in London,' naming the Earl and his place of residence in the metropolis. He said, 'Will you see it done?' I said, 'I will do my best to get it done.' He said, 'Do, and I will trouble the house no more.' It then walked out of the room and left her. As soon as the woman saw that the apparition had departed, she went to the room door and set up a loud shout. The steward and his wife, together with all the other servants, ran to her immediately. They were all clinging to one another and carrying lights. It seemed that they had all been waiting to see the issue of the interview between the woman and the apparition. They asked her what was the matter. She then told them all that had taken place, and showed them the box, The steward dare not meddle with it, but his wife was of a more courageous temperament, and, with the assistance of the other servants, tugged it out, and found the key in the place indicated by the apparition. The woman stated that, by the way in which they lifted it, it appeared to be pretty heavy, but that she did not see it opened, and therefore did not know what it contained, whether money or writings of importance to the family, or both. The servants took it away with them, and the woman averred that she then went to bed and slept peaceably till the morning. It appeared, from what was subsequently learnt, that the box and its contents were sent to the Earl in London, together with an account of how it was discovered and by whom. The Earl immediately sent down orders to his steward to inform the poor woman, who had been the means of the discovery, that if she would come and reside in his family, she should be comfortably provided for the remainder of her days; or if she did not care to reside constantly with them, if she would let him know when she wanted assistance, she should be liberally supplied at his lordship's expense as long as she lived. And according to the account related by Mr. John Hampson, it was a fact well known in the neighbourhood that the woman had been supplied from the Earl's family ever since the time when the affair was said to have happened. End of section 60.